Hi and welcome to my channel. My name is Lorraine, my nickname is Rainey, and you can call me Rainey. This video is focusing on painting from a photograph. This medium that I'm using in this video is watercolor, and here is a checklist of things you want to consider before you begin using a photograph and making changes to that photograph in a significant way. So you're going to want to figure out your light source, what you need to take in and out, how you want to crop it, and then you want to make some decisions about how you can get the viewer to look at your center of interest. So those are all things to think of in advance. I selected a photograph and the format of the photo was a little too square, so I cropped off some of the sky that wasn't necessary. And you can also change placement, and you can determine all those things when you're doing your value sketch, which I'm doing here. Now, the entire paint time for this entire video was over 3 hours, and so I have really sped it up so as not to bore you with all this watching of paint dry. So you do the value sketch first. That's just darks and lights. A pencil sketch, it can be small. It will help you simplify your subject, and it will help you figure out if you have a good value pattern, which is your darks and your lights, a design of darks and lights. The second phase is doing a color study. That's figuring out your color scheme and how to mix those colors. A lot of times with watercolor, it's timing. You know, you don't want to have your water on your paper and then say, oh, how am I going to mix that green or blue? Which blue am I going to use, and do I want to tint it? So those are decisions you want to make in advance in your sketchbook. Take notes so you don't have to have it committed to memory, even though later it will become committed to memory. You'll notice here I added a fence post on the right hand side that was not in the photograph. I wanted to have a little gateway opening to bring you back into the field and heading toward the barns. Here I am laying in my sky color. I'm painting around the area that will be the tree line behind the barns. And the reason I'm doing that is if I painted that whole area blue and then I added a green over the top of it, I would end up with a bluer green, and I want a more yellow green. This is going to be a summer scene, and so I want those greens to be fresh, in some areas lighter, catching the light to indicate that we're in a summer season. So that is the reason why I painted around all of those little tree areas. This entire painting took almost 4 hours to paint, and so I have sped it up significantly, and it still has made quite a lengthy video. I will typically not post a video that's this long because I know it's difficult for people to get the time to watch a full-length video, but I thought it was worth posting this one, and you can watch it over time if you don't have time in one sitting to watch it, just to see the entire process. Seeing little piece is helpful, but seeing the whole thing as it goes is you can get some insights in that might be missed otherwise. So what I've done here is I've mixed a red, that's alizarin crimson, mixed with a color complement of one of the greens. And so I'm laying in my details for the barns first. The beautiful thing about this summer, turning this into a summer scene, is those barns are going to sit right against the greens of the trees and the grasses. And so right off the bat, you have a technique to bring the viewer's eye to the barns because you're using color complements. That's a wonderful way to manipulate the viewer's eye to look where you want them to look. That's to put color complements right next to each other, and immediately it draws attention to this area of the painting. So this first phase of the trees and the just behind the barns, I'm laying in a yellowish green because some of the leaves I want to be highlighted as if the sun was hitting them. And so I'm going to paint in layers and build. I'll let this layer of the greens dry, and then I'll go back, or as it dries, I'll add little darker colors. So I'm working from light to dark. And in the big areas, I can just make sweeping applications of paint. And I'm a little more careful near the sky, but you notice I'm not a slave to those lines that I created because they can be fixed later when we are adding all of the other greens. The fence posts in the background, actually all the fence posts I'm painting over at the moment, they're going to be darker than the grasses, so I don't have to really paint around them. I noticed there's a cat hair, a few little bits and bobs of things on my paint surface. A lot of times I'll just leave them until it dries, because if you start trying to pick off a cat hair in a wet wash, it can sometimes lead to blooms. And but the paint here, the reason I was able to do it here, first of all, I'm going to be going over this later with other darker layers of paint, but also it's very wet, and so I can lift it off while it's still wet. Now, if it was in another phase of the painting process and the shine was gone and I put a wet brush to it, then I would be in a little bit of trouble. But here I'm good. So here we go. You see the paint is still wet, and I'm adding those dark values around the barn to try to make them pop forward. What I did was I had to stop because the paper was just way too wet. And here I'm making more controlled applications of the trees, the dark, deep trees. And you'll notice that everything dried significantly lighter than it did when I after my first application. After the first application of paint, it was actually a color I wanted, and I sometimes tend to forget how significantly watercolor dries lighter. So that's something to consider when you begin, is to maybe be a little bolder than you might. Now, I can't say that I always do that. I tend to be a slow, methodical person who paints with watercolor in glazing techniques, which is a glazing technique is you apply your first layer of paint like I did here, and then you let the whole thing go dry, completely dry. And you're going to know that your paper is dry when it's flat, there's no more buckling, and if it's cool to the touch, you know that it's still wet. And in order to do an effective glazing technique, you will want to let it dry completely. And so here we are trying to define some of the shadows on the barn. You notice I have a magnifying glass. I've got trifocals these days, and I do like to do, smaller paintings. So sometimes I resort to a magnifying glass just to get those little details in the house. And so what I did was I used the same color combination, but first of all, it's going to go over darker because I already have a layer of it on there. And also it has more pigment and not as much water, so it will be darker. So, and then I got tired of doing that barn, and so I jumped over to do the trees. I tend to paint all over the piece at once. I work it all over and I come back and forth. And I know I've seen some artists that paint from top to bottom or left to right, and I'm honestly not that methodical. So I don't think there's any right or wrong to the way that you create. As long as we're creating, that's the thing. It can be a real lifeline. That's to be sure. So I wanted there to be some real highlights next to the barn, so I'm trying to lay in that really light summery green. So I'm trying to get some of that color in the trees behind the barns. It's a watercolor can be fun and challenging, and the beautiful thing is it has these things that it does, like it's doing now. I'm applying that green paint and it's just bursting. That's because the paint on the brush is wet and the paper is wet, and look what it does. That's it can be challenging, but once you know what the timing is for it, it can be so exciting and lots of fun. And so my style is to use what watercolor will do, and then at the very end, when it's dry, I put in the final details. But as much as I can, I try to use those wet and wet, spontaneous things that watercolor does. So when you have the combination of those two different styles, it can be really interesting. So let's see, more green, lots of green. I can say that green is a very difficult color to make look realistic. It can always appear to be a little bit harsh. And so in order for you to gray down your greens, you need to go across the color wheel from red and mix a color complement so that the green out of the tube isn't so harsh. A lot of times the green that I start with is a sap green, but if you use a hooker's green or a phthalo green, they can be very harsh, and you definitely want to gray them down. And you can use a red or an orange. A lot of times I'll gray my greens down using burnt sienna, and which is a great, makes it look much more realistic. So one of the keys to painting any subject is to know your subject. And so with trees, you know that they're big clusters, branches underneath there, and then big clusters of leaves together, and they create these shadows. And so that's what I'm trying to paint in layers. So I'll go in, and you notice I'm putting some of the greens on. It'll have a sharp edge, and I'll go back in and soften it. So you've got a lot more flexibility than you think you do with watercolor. There does come a point though where you can overwork it and get mud, but I would push past those places and finish. Come what may, you're going to want to finish. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about how I'm going to do a sweeping wash in the foreground, because you see those fence posts. I painted around the initial layer of green I put on them, but I did paint around those with the second application of paint. And I really want to have a very, very dark foreground, well, at least some shadows that are coming across the fence. And so in watercolor, you need to save your white or save the light area somehow. And there are a couple of techniques you can use. One is masking fluid, the other is painting around it, which if you're painting around an area that you want to save as a lighter area, sometimes if you're trying to do a sweeping wash, you can't get a beautiful sweeping wash because you're trying to paint around these areas. So you see the rooftops there. I painted around those. That was a small area. It was easy to paint around those. But these fence posts are big, and they're right in the middle of that field. So what I'm going to do is I am going to use masking tape. Now, when you apply masking tape, when you tape your paper to your board, or when you use it to save a light space or a white space on your paper, you are not going to want to leave that masking fluid on for any length of time. And you're not going to want to take it off before it's completely dry. When you do take it off, you're going to want to take it off very, very carefully so as not to take off part of your painting with it. So I would say the rule of thumb with watercolor all the way around is to be patient, to work methodically. Try not to rush through it. Enjoy the process, and that will hold you in good stead all the way across the boards on it, to be sure. So I'm just building. You can tell that this video is sped up 20%, so you can imagine how slow the actual painting process was. It was, if you were watching it, you would consider it painfully slow. I'm finding this 20 times sped up version painfully slow. So if you've made it this far, I appreciate it, and you're a trooper. So let me just pause for a minute and see if there's anything else that I need to say before I let you go to listen to some music. I can't see anything. You'll notice at the very end, when I have removed the masking tape on those fence posts, I can go in and paint those fence posts, even though they will have a little bit of green underneath them, but it'll be easier to paint them because they're darker. So I guess that's the only thing of note. I do think that at the very end I used some gouache to put in some of the wildflowers in the foreground. Gouache is an opaque water-based paint. Your typical watercolors do not, they come with a Chinese white, but I try not to use white most of the time if I can avoid it. And your painting will be a little fresher. And if you're planning on showing your work at some higher levels, I do believe they frown on mixing transparent watercolor. If any of you know the reason why, or if that's true, please leave a comment so I'm not misleading anybody about that. But I do believe if you're trying to compete at a high level with watercolor, then you do not want to mix gouache to your transparent watercolor piece. Just for aesthetics, I know the gouache has a chalkier appearance, and so sometimes it can take away a little bit from your piece. But if it's between losing a piece and using gouache, always use gouache. If you're going to give up on it, please don't, and go ahead and use gouache if you need to. White gouache. Gouache comes in a full array of colors, but I will typically use the gouache white if I end up getting into trouble in one of my paintings. So anyway, I wanted to thank you for watching, and if you're new, I'd like to thank you so much for stopping by. If you have come back, kudos, thank you, thank you, thank you. I appreciate it. And until next time,